The other month I was asked if I wanted to judge the first ever Half-Life Alyx mapping competition. My response was, you can map for that? And I think I was more inclined to enter a map myself than I was to judge it. Besides, I couldn't guarantee that I'd have the time to judge such an unknown entity. If there were 4 or 5 entries, maybe. But imagine if there had been like a dozen entries that all needed rigorous testing and judging. There were 23. The competition has ended, the winners announced. I was initially only going to play through the winning entries, but then I thought that would be missing what we've got here. I don't just want to experience the best of what Source 2 is capable of. I also want to know what an average submission is like, or even a bad one. What makes for a good VR map? And what makes for a bad one? I haven't played through them all just yet, I'm getting there, but in this video I'm only going to be covering 2 of them. Because just from these 2, I have already learned so much about mapping for Half-Life Alyx. Bear in mind that the editor wasn't even out at the time. You had to download custom stuff and jump through so many hoops before you could even start mapping that I commend all 23 mappers for managing anything whatsoever. I will just say that I use teleport to move around because I find it a lot more comfortable in extended play sessions than smooth move is. I don't know anybody personally who disagrees with this, but I get a lot of comments hating on teleport. Maybe these people assume that since smooth movement makes for a better YouTube video, that it must also make for a better VR experience. I don't know. I prefer teleport. On to the maps. The first one I tried was Socks, and it left a great impression. It's such a relief to step out of that first room and to be greeted to an expansive city view and night sky. The official campaign of Half-Life Alyx was extremely claustrophobic, and after a while it made me pine for freedom. So this sort of scale was appreciated. The quality of this entry was just a tad below the campaign of Half-Life Alyx, but still impressively high for such an early community map. Graphically, it looked good, but understandably not quite so polished as the official game. And the world was easy to navigate, but at times was just a little bit less readable. An example of this would be the rubble here. I don't look at that and immediately assume that I can go there, but I still have to try it just to find out. And when I discover an invisible wall, it establishes in my mind that I won't be able to traverse other bits of the level like this, teaching me the rules of how this entry will play. It gives me a gun that I must pick up and load. It has those wooden planks you must pull out to get past. And then it's time for the first enemy. And this is a fine example of a tutorial sequence. The zombie starts a long way away, coming towards you slowly and in a straight line, and it's easily visible against the fiery background. I'm not sure how I feel about collecting resin in a custom level. It feels more like something you'd get in a campaign, and I'm not sure how much time you'd have to use the upgrades in something shorter. The design of this room is extremely simple, but it holds up to the scrutiny of VR, and it had enough interactive objects for me to want to mess about with to distract me from what I was meant to be doing. Leaving the room, I head off down into an alleyway. And then the first Combine fight starts. If I'm honest, their placement wasn't so immediately apparent. You're put up against 3 enemies, with only a music cue to warn you that the fight has begun. Do you remember the grenades in Half-Life 2? They would explode far sooner. You'd have to immediately whip out the gravity gun to stand a chance of launching them back at the enemy. But this game gives you all the time in the world to throw it back, even if you mess it up several times. I expect VR games to get less forgiving as time goes on, but right now it encourages me to interact with this sort of stuff instead of immediately getting out of there because it's overwhelming. And that's when it crashed. I tried it again and it crashed in the same place again, at which point I gave up and assumed the map was broken. What a shame. But from what I saw, this map was excellent. The second map I'm covering is the main focus of this video. It's quite long and attempts many of the gameplay elements found in Half-Life Alyx. But it's where this goes wrong, or where deviating from the tried and tested approach backfires, that makes this such an interesting entry. I'm going to sound very critical of it in this video, but I don't want you, or its mapper, to take it the wrong way. I'm not trying to tear this entry to shreds, but rather to try and understand what it attempted to do, and how it could have done better. And I think anyone interested in mapping for VR needs to watch this, as it will save them a lot of time that would otherwise be spent making the same mistakes themselves. This map is called Mod Bulldog, and compared with the first entry I covered, it's more like I'd expect from an early map for an experimental type of game. It's a good length, with plenty of combat and a few puzzles, but the quality throughout is low. It would take a long time to bring this entry up to a high graphical quality, but gameplay-wise, a few quick adjustments would be able to massively improve it, since I feel it makes some big mistakes which should have been quickly spotted in playtesting. you're immediately greeted to this text. And I love this kind of stuff. It's clear we're in experimental territory here. And I love how the mapper's so straight up and honest with the player about it all. It's all like, there's a problem, I'm sorry, and here's the solution. Have fun. I did as I was told, and it wasn't an issue. So after doing this, you step out of the truck and into a place that looks more like a Half-Life 2 level in terms of detail, and then it's straight off down into the sewers. And then into a multi-storey car park, which also looks like a place straight out from Half-Life 2 Episode 1. In a game so heavily reliant on props, it's obvious where the mapper has tried to paint their own scenery. It's not so easy to get away with it as it was with Half-Life 2, and this antlion nest looks like a tarpaulin with a gooey texture over the top. I mean, it's fine, it's to be expected when the game doesn't have the assets that you need for what you want to make, but it immediately highlights that this is a less professional, user-made submission. So these fights against antlions serve as a kind of tutorial, with the difficulty level being increased on each floor that you pass up through. That's cool, and it works well. It's just unfortunate a multi-storey car park was chosen for this level, since it causes a problem that is quite unique to VR. Turning all these corners is not a fun thing to do. Either you turn in person and end up getting tangled in your headset's cables, or you manually rotate using the joystick, which is what I did, and doing this just feels janky and fiddly. Add enough corners this close together, connecting enough similar looking rooms, all dimly lit and with tunnel vision from your torch, and it becomes a disorienting experience. It makes you want to get out of there. It takes a level like this to highlight that this is a problem in VR, and it makes you appreciate how few corners you need to turn in the main campaign for Half-Life Alyx in comparison. It also highlighted how much space these antlions need to get about. I don't think the low ceilings of this car park can be that enjoyable for them either. A classic thing in mapping is to light up where you've got to go, which you can see is used to good effect with the doorway here. However, this is when stuff like this ends. The way this next room is designed, it draws your eyes to the partially open lift shaft and implies you're supposed to get through here somehow. Especially since you can see the shotgun on the other side. You can even reach through and pick up the ammunition for it. But despite all this, you're not meant to get it just yet. But as I left this room, I couldn't help but think I'd left behind a weapon that I was supposed to have picked up. And then it's on to another stairwell that you have to go around and around and around, getting tangled up in the cables as you go. There's something thrilling about eerie stuff like this in VR. I'm kind of half expecting him to blink or to be jolted to life, but thankfully he didn't, because I would probably have shat myself. And then guess what? It's around and round and round again, only this time leaping between spiky, low-detail user-generated surfaces. To give it credit, it's actually quite fun. It's just a weird mix of cutting edge and the kind of mapping techniques I remember seeing 15 years ago. And then you go through a series of apartments, and they're much darker than they need to be. Remember, it's daylight outside, and yet I'm stuck in here using my torch to find my way. There was some fun gameplay through these sections as I used the shotgun to blast zombies and headcrabs. But I think what happened here is that the mapper designed an apartment, then to save time, copy-pasted it about 4 or 5 times to extend the length of the level. It's just that he didn't bother adding unique stuff in each to find, so it ended up feeling like wasted space. Plus, with the number of enemies here, I got dangerously close to running out of ammunition. Half-Life Alyx itself is a game about scavenging, so I'm used to being low on ammunition, but normally you can find at least something to use if you take the time to search drawers and the like, but there was nothing to find here, aside from some extremely dodgy clipping on these fridges. Having your hand pass through a handle in VR is a sin. Anyway, you reach this laser wall and it's quite obvious that you need to follow the wiring back around to the control panel. I was surprised when the door opened to reveal an enemy, but I think for once, he was even more surprised than I was. So here's something that's simple, but not exactly intuitive or obvious the first time you see it. It's clear the cable goes into this control panel. Normally in the game you can hack this kind of thing on the end, but not in this example. So I was close to going back and retracing my steps, but decided to take a closer look at that control panel to see if there was something to pull or to press, even though I couldn't see anything lit up. And it turns out the hacking minigame carries on through this thing. And I'm not stupid, I still remember that blue laser grid back there that has something to do with this. But when you complete a puzzle and it hasn't made it immediately obvious what it's changed, you do begin to question yourself. Is there another bit of the puzzle you need to complete? Is there something else to press in this room before moving on? And so on. I returned to the laser grid and, fortunately, had managed to turn it off. I'll tell you what, it was a relief to get my hands on some more ammunition, and so much at that. What wasn't so needed was this weapon upgrade station. There just hasn't been enough resin in this level to be able to afford anything decent. The pistol came with a laser sight. Had there been a spare 40 resin or so lying about, then I'd have appreciated the opportunity to choose the upgrades I cared most about, like the automatic reloaders or something. But as it was, this was a missed opportunity. In fact, maybe I was the one missing the opportunities. Maybe I was supposed to have found a way to get inside to get these gun turrets. And maybe, had I pulled these levers in this dark corner over here, there might have been a load of resin inside. In which case, my bad. As it was, I just headed through to the next stage of the level. Now this was a fight. In Half-Life Alyx, you typically only fight 2 to 3 enemies at once, but there are about 6 of them here, and you don't have that much ammunition, and they're such bullet sponges. Still, there was a good amount of cover and space to run about in, and I had a good time in this fight. The pathfinding seemed a bit broken as enemies didn't want to move that much, so I'm not sure how one had apparently managed to get around behind me like this. Manhacks are the one time I consider broken pathfinding to be an improvement. Even with Source 2 and its highly detailed props, glitches can happen. I currently have no experience with mapping for it, so I am unable to say how easy it is to avoid stuff like this, but it's highly distracting in VR and a sign that it's an amateurish level. I appreciate the occasional puzzle that's thrown in as it helps add variety to the experience and to slow the pace down after periods of running and shooting. VR needs breaks such as these, and I'm beginning to imagine that viewing a shaky VR video like this, you're happy to see some slower paced footage like this once in a while as well. You know that something's got to happen in a room as elaborate as this. It doesn't immediately drop you in a fight, but instead lets you explore it and learn what it's all about first. Here's something that I almost missed. A machine gun's waiting for you inside that box. If it hadn't been for the machine gun ammunition sat around it, I don't think I'd have noticed that it was sitting inside. And maybe this map's maker is just very tall, because this box is up so high, if I was 5'6" or smaller, I wouldn't have been able to see inside this. Here's an example of unintuitive placement. Connecting the battery here, it activates the lever to the right of it that I tried earlier, but since there are cables trailing out to the left, I assume it has something to do with that instead, and it leads me off on a hunt for something that doesn't exist. Had the battery panel been put on the other side of the lever, with nothing else that side of it, it would have been more natural to check the lever. Sure, it's got a green light next to it to show that you can pull it now, but it wasn't visible, nor my focus, when placing the battery in the first place. Pulling this activated some kind of animation in the far corner of the room, which I noticed. So I walked towards it and straight into a trap. This section made me realise that the Valve-made levels for Half-Life Alyx would always have you in a position with good cover before getting into a fight. This is more important in virtual reality than it is in normal games, because moving about in VR takes more effort. If you're trying to get to cover, you're not too interested in shooting back at the enemies, because you're trying to get to cover, which, in this case, involves sprinting back to the control panels again. And then, just when I think it's safe, another door opens, and a huge super armoured Combine steps out and it's back to the control panels again. And then it's onto the rooftop, a fitting scene for the finale to take place. And how nice it is to be somewhere that's well lit. And it's weird to see the Citadel with so little haze shrouding its lower levels. It's quite nice to mix the combat up by placing lots of thin beams between you and the enemies. Combine and Half-Life Alyx deal huge damage, so fights generally comprise 90% of hiding away and 10% about pumping bullets into them before they can open fire again. But here you can't just open fire when you've got to carefully aim between cracks to conserve ammunition. Like I said before, it's amazing the difference this open area makes. It feels like the map's budget went into this final sequence and placing all of the distant details everywhere. I can even see the playground from the start down here, which helps me to get my bearings. But what a missed opportunity. Stepping out of the truck at the start, you're looking the wrong way and have no need to look back at the building behind you. Had you started this side of the park, you would have begun facing the building you ultimately reach, which tells a coherent story. Or, better still, if this building and the Citadel had been visible and in the same direction as each other, then there would have been no confusion as to the direction you were meant to be headed. And it makes the level into a story of sorts, rather than just a series of disconnected rooms that you have to navigate. So it took me a while to figure out what to do here. It's a multi-tool puzzle which involves stooping down and running it along the ground, which is more effort than it looks in VR. This would be a criticism that I have with the game's mechanics. It would be nice if you didn't have to get quite so close to surfaces that you're trying to scan, which I guess is why they're usually within arm's reach without having to stoop over. And then, again, it isn't obvious what you're supposed to do since you've just been led towards these control panels, but you're actually meant to return back to the start of the puzzle and to twist this thing. At which point I was like, oh, I'm meant to shoot these. But apparently not. But you are. It just takes 3 shots each. Again, a bit unintuitive in a game that forces you to conserve your ammunition. And then, in another cruel twist, after the last of these is destroyed, without warning it spawns a load of enemies behind you. You have good cover, but they quickly encroach on your position from several different angles. And then I was insta-killed by a set piece.
Alyx?
And then I had to replay this whole section from this point. The second time I was killed by an enemy with an endless magazine. But the third time, I did it. It looked like it formed a bridge across the next building, but I couldn't figure out how to get up there, or even if all of the enemies had been killed. And that was the end. Or is it? Nope, it's definitely the end. So, all in all, an interesting dive into workshop content for Half-Life Alyx. Even though I've pointed out its many flaws, this map was an enjoyable experience. It makes me excited to dabble with my own creations, since now I think I appreciate interesting cover and fight locations a lot more, knowing what works and, more importantly, what doesn't. Thank you to the mappers involved in this competition, and from how critical I've been in this video, maybe it's just as well that I wasn't a judge.